The twin suns hung mercilessly over the alien sky, their brutal heat turning the endless desert into a shimmering expanse of gold and dust. The wind howled across the dunes, carrying whispers of forgotten things, lost battles, buried secrets, and the cries of those who had perished under its unforgiving rule. Captain Ryland Carter stumbled forward, each step sinking into the burning sand, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His ship, his only way off this forsaken rock, was now nothing more than twisted wreckage miles behind him, smoke rising like a dying beacon against the horizon. His water supply was nearly gone, his body was drenched in sweat, and the heat was beginning to play tricks on his mind. He had crash-landed in worse places before, but this world felt different. There was something wrong about the silence. Then he saw her. At first, he thought it was another cruel illusion, the kind the desert loved to weave into the minds of the desperate. But as he stepped closer, the mirage refused to fade. A figure lay motionless on the sand, half buried beneath the shifting dunes, her skin catching the light in an unnatural way. Ryland hesitated. There was no sign of a ship, no footprints, nothing to indicate how she had come to be here. He took another step, and his pulse quickened. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall, slender, her form seemingly sculpted from something more delicate than human flesh. Her skin, a shade somewhere between ivory and silver, bore intricate golden markings that spiraled down her arms and across her torso, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. Her long, dark hair was splayed around her like a black halo, strands moving slightly with the wind. She was utterly still, eyes closed, lips parted slightly as if caught in the middle of a breath she had never finished. And she wore nothing. Ryland swallowed hard, his survival instincts warring with his sense of decency. This wasn't normal. Even for an alien species, this wasn't how people were found in the middle of nowhere. There was no shelter, no supplies, no indication that she had chosen to be here. The way her body lay, as if placed deliberately upon the sands, set his nerves on edge. This wasn't an accident. Something had left her here. He crouched beside her, pressing 2 fingers against the side of her throat. A heartbeat, faint but steady. She was alive, though barely. The golden markings on her skin almost seemed to pulse under his touch, reacting to his presence. Ryland drew his hand back instinctively, eyes narrowing. Then the wind shifted. A distant howl echoed across the dunes, not from the wind, but from something else, something alive. The kind of sound that made even seasoned soldiers tighten their grip on their weapons. Ryland's jaw tensed. He didn't have a weapon. He barely had anything besides the emergency knife strapped to his boot. If something was out there hunting, he was already at a disadvantage. His gaze flickered back to the woman. Leaving her here meant certain death for both of them. Cursing under his breath, he scooped her up, surprised at how light she was. Despite the brutal sun, her skin was strangely cool to the touch. As he shifted her against his chest, something about her felt important. There was a presence to her, something unspoken yet undeniable. He had no idea who she was or why she had been abandoned, but one thing was clear. She was no ordinary traveler. As he took his first step toward the distant rock formations, his only chance of shelter, the woman stirred. A slow inhale, a barely there movement of her fingers. And then, her eyes snapped open. Ryland froze. Her irises weren't any color he had ever seen. They burned with a deep, liquid gold, the same shade as the markings on her skin. For a moment, the world around them seemed to still, the wind silencing, the heat fading, the endless dunes stretching infinitely in all directions. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. And Ryland realized, with a cold certainty, that he wasn't the only one stranded on this world. He wasn't the only one being hunted. Ryland barely had time to react before the woman in his arms tensed, her golden eyes widening with something between fear and confusion. A sharp intake of breath shuddered through her as if she had been pulled from the depths of a deep, unnatural sleep. Her lips parted, and she whispered something, words he didn't understand, syllables that rolled off her tongue like liquid silver, full of urgency. He tightened his grip around her instinctively, shifting her weight to make carrying her easier. But the moment he did, she flinched, her body trembling. Was it pain? Panic? He wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. She was waking up, and she was terrified. "Easy," Rylan muttered, not knowing if she could understand him. "I'm getting us out of here." She blinked rapidly, her expression flickering between exhaustion and shock. Her gaze locked onto his face, as if trying to process who, or what, he was. Then her golden irises darted toward the horizon, past him, past the dunes, searching, scanning. And then, suddenly, they went wide with terror. Before Rylan could turn, a sound cut through the air, a sharp, high-pitched whirring, growing louder by the second. His instincts screamed at him to move. Without thinking, he threw himself to the side, sand exploding around them as a pulse of energy slammed into the spot where he had been standing just a second ago. A sniper shot. Rylan hit the ground hard, twisting his body to shield the woman as another shot streaked through the air, narrowly missing them. The dunes erupted in a cloud of dust and heat, the scent of scorched sand filling his nostrils. Damn it. They weren't alone. He rolled over, keeping low, and finally spotted them, figures emerging from the haze of the desert, clad in dark armor that shimmered faintly under the twin suns. They moved with precision, their weapons sleek, advanced, built for one purpose: hunting. Bounty hunters. And they were coming for her. The woman trembled against him, weak but alert, her fingers curling against his chest as she tried to push herself up. Rylan caught her before she could fall and shook his head. "Not a good time to start walking," he muttered, glancing toward the hunters. He counted at least 5, maybe more in the distance, all heavily armed. This wasn't some random attack. These people knew she was here. They had been tracking her, which meant they wouldn't stop until she was dead. The woman's breathing was ragged, her body still unsteady. She was in no condition to run. Rylan's mind raced. He had no weapons, no backup, and no idea who the hell she even was. All he knew was that these hunters wanted her dead, or worse. He clenched his jaw. Leaving her behind wasn't an option. The first bounty hunter stepped forward, raising his rifle. The visor of his helmet reflected the sun, masking his face, but his voice was clear, crackling through a built-in translator. "Human, step away from the girl." Rylan didn't move. The hunter took another step. "She is property of the High Order. You are interfering in royal matters." Royal? Rylan's grip on the woman tightened. His instincts had been right. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was something bigger, something powerful, and something dangerous. The woman spoke suddenly, her voice raw, desperate. It wasn't in English, but Rylan could hear the plea in it. She was trying to tell him something. The bounty hunter growled. "She is a traitor. She belongs to us." Rylan exhaled sharply. "Yeah, see, that's where I have a problem." Without another word, he lunged. The move caught the hunter off guard, just enough for Rylan to grab his weapon and twist it out of his hands. A quick, brutal strike to the throat sent the armored man staggering back. Rylan barely had time to react before the others opened fire. He grabbed the woman and ran. The dunes shifted under his feet, slowing him down as plasma shots ripped through the air. The desert offered little cover, but he spotted a jagged rock formation up ahead. His only chance. He pushed forward, his legs burning, his breath ragged. The woman clung to him weakly, her strength fading with every passing second. Shots slammed into the sand behind them, each one getting closer. Almost there. The moment they reached the rocks, Rylan ducked behind the largest boulder, pressing the woman against it for cover. He peeked out just in time to see the bounty hunters regrouping, closing in. They weren't in a rush. They knew he was trapped. He gritted his teeth. He needed a plan. Fast. The woman suddenly reached up, touching his arm. He turned to her, expecting another desperate plea. Instead, she lifted a trembling hand and pressed it against the golden markings on her skin. A faint hum filled the air. The symbols on her body began to glow. Ryland stared. What the hell? A surge of energy crackled around them, and for the first time, the hunters hesitated. And then, in a voice laced with power, the woman spoke. The desert shifted. The wind roared. And Ryland realized, whatever she had just said, it had changed everything. The desert trembled. It wasn't a trick of the heat or the shifting dunes. Something deeper, more primal had been awakened. The wind, once a dry and ceaseless whisper, suddenly howled as if warning of something unseen. The bounty hunters hesitated, their weapons still raised, but their posture stiffened as the golden glow on the woman's skin pulsed like a heartbeat. Ryland didn't know what was happening, but he knew an opportunity when he saw one. Without waiting for an explanation, he grabbed the woman's wrist and yanked her to her feet. She stumbled, barely able to stand, but she didn't resist. If anything, she seemed to trust him now, her grip tightening as she leaned against him for support. The ground rumbled again. The bounty hunters shifted uneasily. One of them took a cautious step forward, lifting his communicator. "She's activating something," he muttered into the device. "Possible energy signature." A deep guttural roar split the air. Everything stopped. The hunters turned as one. Ryland felt the woman tense beside him, and for the first time, he saw real fear in her golden eyes. Another roar, closer this time. Then the sand exploded. A monstrous shape burst from beneath the surface, showering them all in a storm of dust and debris. The creature was massive, its serpentine body covered in jagged armored plates that shimmered like obsidian in the twin sunlight. It had no visible eyes, but its head was crowned with a ring of gaping, razor-lined maws that twisted and snapped hungrily. Ryland's stomach dropped. A sand beast. Of course, this cursed planet would have something like that. The hunters reacted first, their weapons shifting toward the new threat. But the moment the first plasma bolt struck its armor, the creature turned with terrifying speed, its multiple jaws opening in a screech that rattled Ryland's bones. Then it attacked. Chaos erupted. The bounty hunters scattered as the sand beast lunged, its massive form moving impossibly fast for something of its size. One of the hunters wasn't quick enough. The creature's jaws snapped shut around him, cutting off his scream instantly. The others fired in panic, but their shots barely slowed it down. Ryland didn't waste another second. "Time to go," he muttered, pulling the woman with him. She was weak, struggling to move, but whatever energy had pulsed through her earlier had given her just enough strength to run. They moved together, stumbling across the dunes as the battle raged behind them. A sudden explosion sent a shockwave through the sand. Ryland risked a glance back and saw one of the hunters had detonated something near the creature's side, blowing off a chunk of its armored plating. But instead of retreating, the sand beast shrieked, a piercing, unnatural sound that made his vision blur for a split second. Then it dove back into the dunes. The sand churned violently as it disappeared beneath the surface. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ryland slowed, pulling the woman behind a ridge of jagged stone. Then he saw it. The hunters were regrouping, but they were making a fatal mistake. They were too focused on each other, shouting into their communicators, trying to regain control of the situation. None of them noticed the way the sand had begun to shift beneath their feet. A second later, the beast struck again. It erupted from below, engulfing two of them in an instant. The others barely had time to react before it coiled around them, its armored body crushing one of the hunters against the rocks with sickening force. Ryland didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and kept running, dragging the woman with him as the roars of the dying filled the air behind them. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, offering no shelter, no escape. The only chance they had was to find higher ground, something the sand beast couldn't burrow through. Ryland's lungs burned, his body screaming in protest. But he didn't stop. Neither did she. By the time they reached the edge of a crumbling rock formation, both of them were on the verge of collapse. Ryland hauled them up onto the first ledge, hands scraped raw from the jagged stone. He turned, breath ragged, and scanned the dunes below. Silence. The sand beast was gone, or at least it had finished its hunt. There was no sign of the bounty hunters, just a few scattered weapons half buried in the sand. The woman sagged against the rock, her body trembling. Ryland could feel the exhaustion radiating off her, the way her strength had almost completely drained away. But she was still awake, still watching him. He exhaled, leaning his head back against the stone. "Well," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow, "I'd ask what the hell that was about, but I have a feeling I'm not gonna like the answer." The woman hesitated, her golden eyes darkening. She swallowed, her lips parting as if trying to form words in his language. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "More will come." Ryland's grip tightened on the rock beside him. Of course they would. And next time, it wouldn't just be bounty hunters. The wind howled as the twin suns dipped lower, casting the desert in shades of deep amber and violet. Ryland sat against the rough stone, his muscles aching from exhaustion, his thoughts racing. The alien woman lay beside him, her breathing shallow but steady. The golden glow on her skin had faded, leaving only the intricate markings that looked almost like they had been painted on her by something ancient, something not meant for human eyes. She had spoken to him, not in her own language, but in his. Barely a whisper, barely enough to register, but enough to tell him that she understood at least some of what was happening, and enough to warn him that this wasn't over. He rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a slow breath. More would come. That much was obvious. The bounty hunters had been prepared, had known exactly where to find her. That meant someone had sent them, and whoever they worked for wasn't going to just let this go. His eyes flickered to her again. She was watching him now, her golden irises dim in the fading light. There was something unreadable in her expression. Not quite fear, not quite trust. Just quiet calculation, like she was trying to decide whether he was really the kind of person who could help her. Ryland exhaled through his nose. He wasn't sure of that himself. "You got a name?" he asked. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, accented, but clear. "Cialara." He nodded. At least now he had something to call her. The moment stretched between them, quiet and uncertain. Then she sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. Her hands traced the markings on her skin, as if feeling for something that was no longer there. Ryland frowned. What's with those, anyway? She looked at him, then glanced away. He could tell she was weighing her words, trying to piece them together in a way he'd understand. Finally, she touched the center of her chest, where the markings were thickest. "They bind." "Bind." She hesitated, then nodded. "A test." Ryland's brow furrowed. "A test for what?" Cilara's hands tightened into fists. "Survival." Something about the way she said it made his stomach turn. He had seen plenty of brutal rituals, plenty of twisted traditions carried out in the name of power. But this felt worse. This felt personal. "You were left out here on purpose, weren't you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Ryland looked away, jaw tightening. He didn't know the details, didn't know the politics of whatever empire she came from, but he knew enough to recognize betrayal when he saw it. And she had been betrayed. A deep silence settled between them as the last of the sunlight faded. The desert was dangerous at night, but they had no choice but to keep moving. If the bounty hunters had tracked her this far, others would too. Cialara shifted, struggling to stand. Ryland caught her before she could fall. "Not a great idea," he muttered. She shook her head stubbornly. "We must go." He sighed. Yeah, I figured. He slung her arm over his shoulder, helping her stay upright. She was weak, but there was a determination in her that he couldn't ignore. Where exactly are we going? He asked. Her fingers curled slightly, as if reaching for something invisible. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she whispered a word. Vault. Ryland's pulse jumped. That word had weight. What kind of vault? He asked. She hesitated, then met his gaze. A ship. That changed everything. If there was a ship, a real one, not a broken wreck, then they had a way off this planet. A way to outrun the people chasing her. But that also meant something else. If she knew where a ship was, then whoever had left her here did too. And they wouldn't want her to reach it. The realization made his stomach sink, but he kept it to himself, one thing at a time. All right, he said, adjusting his grip on her as they began moving. Let's find your vault. The desert stretched out before them, endless and empty. But Ryland had the distinct feeling that something was watching. And whatever it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast ocean of shifting sand and jagged rock formations, all bathed in the eerie glow of the twin moons. The temperature had dropped sharply, turning the once blistering heat into a bone-chilling cold that seeped into Ryland's muscles. Every step forward felt heavier, exhaustion clawing at his body. But he kept moving. He had no other choice. Neither of them did. Silara was barely able to walk. Even with his support, her body swayed unsteadily, her breaths shallow. Whatever power she had drawn on before, the strange energy that had pulsed through her markings, was completely drained now. She was vulnerable, weaker than she wanted to admit. And they weren't alone. Ryland knew it the moment he saw the distant flickers of movement on the horizon, barely visible in the dim moonlight. Shadows slipping between the dunes, keeping their distance but never truly disappearing. He recognized the pattern. They were being hunted. Silara felt it too. Her grip on his arm tightened as she looked toward the shifting figures in the distance, her golden eyes narrowing. She said something under her breath in her own language, words filled with quiet urgency, frustration. Yeah, Ryland muttered. I see them. She glanced up at him, then spoke softly. They will not stop. He already knew that. The bounty hunters from before had only been the first wave. Whoever had sent them wouldn't just give up. Not when they had come so close to capturing her. Not when she was supposed to be dead. How far is this vault? He asked, keeping his voice low. Silara hesitated, looking toward the distance, as if she could sense the direction rather than see it. Close. Ryland exhaled through his nose. Close wasn't exactly a comforting word when armed killers were stalking them. A gust of wind swept through the dunes, carrying with it the distant sound of shifting metal. Not the natural groan of the desert, but something more artificial, more deliberate. Ryland stopped walking. So did Silara. He turned his head slowly, listening. The wind carried another faint noise, like a mechanical whirring, something activating deep beneath the sand. Silara tensed. No, she whispered. Ryland's heart pounded. What? Her golden eyes locked onto his, filled with urgency. They found it first. His stomach dropped. Before he could respond, the desert ahead of them shifted. Sand began to sink, collapsing inward, revealing the skeletal remains of a massive structure half buried beneath the dunes. Twisted metal beams jutted from the ground like the ribs of a long-dead beast. A dark opening yawned at the center, leading down into the unknown. And standing at the edge of that opening, waiting for them, was a group of heavily armed figures. Ryland's grip on Silara tightened. He counted at least 6 of them, all in dark armor, their visors glowing faintly. But one of them stood apart, different from the others. A human. Ryland's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a combat jacket that had seen better days. His face was partially scared, his expression unreadable. But Ryland knew those eyes. knew that stance, because he had seen it before. "Captain Carter," the man called out, his voice carrying over the desert like a blade cutting through silence. "Didn't expect to see you here." Ryland felt Silara stiffen beside him. His blood ran cold. Doran. The name tasted like rust on his tongue. It had been years since he had last seen the man, since they had fought side by side in a war that had left more ghosts than survivors. Doran had been a soldier once, a good one. But now, standing among bounty hunters and mercenaries, he was something else. A traitor. Doran tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his scared mouth. "You always did have a habit of picking the wrong side." Ryland's jaw tightened. "Didn't realize I had." Doran exhaled through his nose, amused. "You know what she is, don't you?" He nodded toward Silara. "What she's worth." Ryland didn't answer. Doran chuckled. "You always were stubborn." He gestured to his men. "But I'll make this simple. Hand her over, and you walk away. No fight. No bullets. No unnecessary deaths." Ryland glanced at Silara. She was watching Doran carefully, her golden eyes sharp, calculating. She understood enough to know this wasn't just a conversation. It was an ultimatum, and she already knew what Ryland's answer would be. He looked back at Doran. "You know me better than that." Doran sighed. "Yeah, I do." He raised his hand. The mercenaries lifted their weapons. Raylan moved before they could fire. He grabbed Silara and shoved her behind the nearest rock as the first shot rang out. Sand exploded where they had been standing seconds before. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, lighting up the night like falling stars. Raylan hit the ground, rolling to the side, grabbing for the only weapon he had left, the emergency knife strapped to his belt. Not much against rifles, but it was better than nothing. Silara crouched beside him, breathing hard. She wasn't a fighter, not in this state, but she wasn't useless, either. Ryland looked at her. "That vault, can you open it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Good." He exhaled. "Stay behind me." Then he moved. Doran's men were trained, but Ryland had one advantage. They thought he was cornered. They weren't expecting him to fight toward them. He burst from cover, closing the distance before they could adjust their aim. The first mercenary went down with a brutal strike to the throat, his weapon flying from his hands. Ryland grabbed it midair and fired, dropping another before they could react. Doran cursed. "Kill him." Silara darted past them, reaching the entrance of the vault. She pressed her hands against the metal, her markings faintly glowing once more. The ancient structure responded. A deep, grinding noise rumbled beneath them as the doors began to shift. One of the mercenaries turned his weapon toward her. Ryland fired first. The man crumpled. Doran snarled, stepping forward, drawing his own weapon. Ryland barely had time to react before a brutal impact slammed into his side. He hit the ground hard, his stolen rifle skidding across the sand. Doran was on him instantly, pressing a knee against his chest, his pistol aimed directly at Ryland's skull. "You don't even know what you're protecting," Doran growled. Ryland gritted his teeth, struggling against the pressure. "Doesn't matter." Doran's finger tightened on the trigger. Then the vault door exploded open. A surge of golden energy burst outward, knocking them both apart. Ryland hit the sand hard, coughing as dust and light filled the air. Doran cursed, shielding his eyes. And standing at the threshold of the vault, bathed in the glow of something ancient and powerful, was Silara. Her markings were alive now, pulsing with an energy that had been dormant for too long. Ryland stared. Doran's men hesitated, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Silara looked like a queen. The desert was silent for half a heartbeat, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then the vault pulsed again, sending out another wave of golden energy that crackled through the air like a living force. The twin moons cast eerie shadows across the sand, but all eyes were locked on Silara. She stood in the open doorway of the ancient vault, her golden markings burning like fire against her skin. The energy that had been faint and flickering before was now a roaring current of power coursing through her. For the first time since Rylan had found her, she looked unbreakable, unstoppable. Doran cursed under his breath, pulling himself to his feet. The pulse of energy had knocked him back, but he recovered quickly, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. His men, still reeling from the shockwave, hesitated, guns half raised, unsure whether to attack or flee. Rylan didn't hesitate. He lunged for the fallen rifle in the sand, rolling as another shot whizzed past his head. He hit the ground, bringing the weapon up in a single smooth motion, and fired. The mercenary closest to him went down in a spray of sand. Doran shouted something, but Rylan didn't hear. His focus was singular: keep them away from Silara. She had unlocked the vault. That meant they had a way out. But first, they had to survive this. Silara lifted a hand, fingers trembling, as the energy from the vault snaked up her arm. The air around her shimmered with power, and for a moment, Rylan swore he saw something behind her: shapes, symbols, ghostly figures flickering in and out of existence. Whatever this place was, it was ancient, and it was waking up. Doran took a step forward, gun still raised. His expression was unreadable, but Rylan knew him too well. He wasn't going to let this go. "Step away from her, Carter," Doran ordered, his voice tight. "You don't know what you're messing with." Rylan scoffed. "Yeah, neither do you." Doran's grip on his gun tightened. "You think you're saving her." He nodded toward Silara. "You don't even realize what she is, do you?" Rylan didn't take the bait. He already knew the truth, or at least enough of it to know that Silara was no ordinary fugitive. She wasn't just some royal exile. She was something far more dangerous. A faint sound echoed from within the vault, like machinery groaning to life after centuries of slumber. Silara flinched, but she didn't look away. She turned slightly, glancing at Rylan, then at the entrance behind her. Then she spoke. Inside. Now. There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of the weakness she had shown before. She had regained some of her strength. Maybe not all of it, but enough to command authority. Enough to make Rylan listen. He fired another shot, forcing Doran's men to duck behind cover, then turned and ran toward her. Doran's snarl of frustration carried through the night. "Stop them." A hail of plasma fire followed, but the moment Rylan crossed the threshold of the vault, everything changed. The air inside was thick, charged with static energy, like stepping through the aftermath of a storm. The walls were lined with metal that shimmered in ways he didn't recognize, technology far older than anything humans had ever built. Dim symbols pulsed across the surface, responding to Silara's presence. And at the far end of the chamber, half buried under centuries of dust and debris, was the ship. Rylan exhaled sharply. It wasn't just some old wreck. It was still intact. If they could power it up, they had a way off this planet. Silara pressed her palm against a nearby console. The golden markings on her skin flared brighter for a moment, and the entire chamber rumbled. A deep mechanical hum filled the space, and the ship's engines flickered with life. Then a gunshot rang out. Silara gasped, stumbling forward as a blast scorched the wall beside her. Rylan spun, rifle raised. Doran had stepped inside the vault. His men hesitated outside, wary of whatever energy pulsed through the ancient structure, but Doran wasn't like them. He had always been the kind of man who pushed forward, no matter the risk. His gun was leveled at Silara, his expression dark. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low. Rylan shifted slightly, positioning himself between Doran and Silara. "No," he countered. "I'm making a choice." Doran's jaw clenched, his finger tightened on the trigger. Before he could fire, Silara moved. The energy coursing through the vault surged toward her, drawn by her presence. It crackled through the air, wrapping around her like an unseen force. She lifted a hand, and in an instant, The temperature in the room shifted. A blast of kinetic force exploded outward. Doran was thrown backward, crashing into the doorway with a curse. His gun clattered to the floor. Outside, his men hesitated, eyes wide. For the first time, they looked afraid. Ryland didn't waste the opening. He grabbed Silara's wrist and pulled her toward the ship. "Can you fly it?" he asked urgently. She hesitated. "It has been a long time." Not the most reassuring answer, but it was better than nothing. Another pulse of golden light radiated from her as she touched the ship's hull. The ancient vessel groaned, its systems flickering to life one by one. Dust and sand shook free as long-dormant engines began to hum with renewed energy. Doran cursed again, picking himself up, but for the first time, there was something uncertain in his eyes. "Carter, listen to me," he tried again. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Ryland met his gaze. "I think I already am." Then the ship's doors sealed shut, cutting off Doran's protests. Inside, the cockpit controls flickered, screens lighting up with unreadable symbols. Silara moved quickly, her hands dancing across the ancient interface. The ship responded, thrusters warming up beneath them. Ryland dropped into the co-pilot's seat, gripping the armrests as the vessel rumbled. Outside, the bounty hunters were scrambling, shouting. Doran was barking orders. Weapons were raised. But it was too late. The ship launched. The desert below became a blur as they rocketed skyward, breaking free of the gravity that had held them prisoner for far too long. As the planet shrank beneath them, Ryland turned to Silara. She was breathing hard, her hands trembling slightly against the controls. But her expression was unreadable. "What now?" he asked. Silara didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the stars ahead, her golden eyes filled with something distant. Then she whispered a word that sent a chill through him. "War." The void of space stretched infinitely before them, stars blinking in the abyss like distant memories. The ship hummed with an ancient energy, its once dormant systems flickering back to life under Silara's touch. The escape had been fast, too easy. Ryland had been in enough fights to know one thing. Nothing was ever that simple. He sat in the co-pilot's seat, watching Silara with careful eyes. She was focused on the controls, her golden irises scanning the unfamiliar symbols flashing across the screens. The ship had responded to her, had opened for her as if it had been waiting all this time for her return. But where exactly were they going? Ryland exhaled and leaned back. "All right, Princess. You want to tell me where we're headed?" Silara hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell him. Then, finally, she spoke. "Safe space." Ryland frowned. "And where's that?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers danced across the console, and the ship responded with a low hum, setting a course deeper into the void. Only then did she turn to him. "Nowhere is safe," she admitted. "But we must go home." Ryland arched an eyebrow. "Home? You mean the place that left you for dead in the desert?" Silara's jaw tightened. "It was not my home that betrayed me. It was the ones who fear me." That didn't exactly answer his question, but before he could press further, the ship's alarms flared to life. A sharp beeping echoed through the cockpit, and the monitors flickered with warning signals. Something was coming. Ryland shot forward in his seat, scanning the radar. The screen was lighting up with incoming ships, multiple contacts closing in fast. "Tell me that's just a welcoming party," he muttered. Silara's fingers curled into fists. "No." The proximity alarms screamed as a fleet of warships emerged from the darkness, massive vessels cutting through space like floating fortresses. Their sleek black hulls bore the insignia of a ruling house. One Ryland didn't recognize, but Silara clearly did. Her entire body went rigid. "They found us," she whispered. Ryland cursed under his breath. "You care to explain who exactly?" She didn't need to. The moment the first transmission came through, he knew. A voice filled the ship, cold and commanding. Princess Silara, you are ordered to surrender immediately. Ryland's stomach twisted. This wasn't some rogue bounty hunting crew. This was an Empire's fleet. Silara's hands hovered over the controls, torn between fight and flight. You knew they'd come, Ryland said. It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Ryland ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the growing fleet ahead. And let me guess, if they take you, you don't get a trial, do you? She shook her head. They do not want a trial. They want to erase me. Ryland let out a slow breath. Right. Of course they do. The ship's computer chimed with another incoming transmission. This time, the voice was different, more personal. Silara, you should not have run. Silara's breath hitched. Ryland turned to her, catching the flicker of pain in her expression. Who is that? She swallowed hard. My brother. Ryland stared at her. Your brother is leading the fleet that's here to kill you. Silara nodded. He took the throne after my exile. If I return, I am a threat. Ryland let out a humorless chuckle. Great. Love family reunions. Another chime. This time, the fleet was locking weapons. Princess Silara, her brother's voice came again. This is your last chance. Surrender and I promise your death will be swift. Silara didn't respond. Ryland exhaled sharply. Okay, so, what's the plan, Princess? Because if we fight, we're dead. If we run, we're dead slightly later. Silara's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then she spoke. We do neither. Ryland blinked. What? She turned to him. We go through them. Ryland narrowed his eyes. Through? You do see the warships, right? Silara didn't answer. Instead, she placed her hand against the ship's console. The markings on her skin lit up like a supernova. A deep rumbling filled the ship as something ancient awakened beneath its surface. The screens flickered wildly, symbols shifting, rearranging, no longer just responding to her, but merging with her presence. Then the ship itself changed. The hull shimmered, shifting into something sleeker, sharper. The power levels spiked. The warships outside hesitated, as if sensing something they hadn't accounted for. Silara's voice was barely above a whisper. This is not just a ship. It is a relic, a forgotten weapon of my ancestors. Ryland's grip tightened on the console. Defying weapon. She looked at him, golden eyes burning. One that has not lost a battle. A heartbeat of silence. Then the ship moved. Not like a standard vessel. Not like anything Ryland had ever flown. It blinked, one moment still, the next shifting through space, cutting through reality itself. The warships opened fire, but the blasts never hit. The ship phased between them, twisting through the battlefield like a ghost. It wasn't just moving. It was dancing through the chaos, dodging laser fire and missiles, as if time itself was bending around it. Ryland barely had time to react before they were inside the fleet, weaving between enemy ships that struggled to lock on. Silara's hands glowed brighter, her connection to the ship growing stronger. Then, the ship fired. A wave of golden energy erupted from its core, expanding outward in a shockwave that disabled everything it touched. Enemy warships flickered, their systems shutting down in an instant. The fleet collapsed into chaos, caught completely off guard. Silara exhaled sharply, her body trembling. It is done, she whispered. Ryland let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The fleet was still there, but they were powerless. The warships drifted aimlessly, their weapons disabled, their thrusters flickering. And in the silence that followed, a final transmission came through. Silara's brother. His voice was shaken. What have you done? Silara's expression was unreadable as she replied. I have returned. Then she ended the transmission. Ryland turned to her, shaking his head. So what now? Silara looked out into the void, her golden eyes fierce. Now we take back what was stolen. Ryland sighed. Yeah, figured you'd say that. As the ship turned toward the distant stars, Rylan had the sinking feeling that this was just the beginning, and he wasn't sure whether that was exciting or terrifying. Maybe both.